All right. It says we're live, so I'll say good morning. And I'm again honored. This is part two of a special report on what we can do. The crisis in Department of Children and Families, whatever it's called in your state. We've had the good fortune to have yesterday and today, and I'm hopefully in the future, Dianne Keech, who was a former deputy director of the Kansas Department of Children and Families. So I can't imagine anybody that's more informed on what needs to be done. And with that, I'll give you Dianne.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to speak with you today, and to all your listeners and watchers. Thank you for tuning in. Grateful for the work that you do and the awareness that you bring to sex trafficking issues. Thank you for your interest in this child welfare issue. Sometimes I speak to people and they give me a polite nod, but they don't really want to delve in or know this information. So thank you for caring. And thank you for all your listeners and watchers who care. You guys are the ones who are going to make a difference. What I want to talk about today is, first of all, I want to talk to you about the problem briefly, in case you didn't hear yesterday's podcast or whenever you're airing that one. And then I want to talk about solutions today. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about solutions, because there are answers. There are problems, but the good news is that there really are answers. So let's talk about, first I want to inform you on how child welfare works. Child welfare has two distinct and separate departments. There's what we call in Kansas the front end, which is Child Protective Services. This is when children are living in their homes with their caregivers, and there's a hotline call that alerts the department that there's some kind of abuse, neglect, or safety concern regarding a child. And workers go to that home and assess, investigate, and determine services, and if those children need to be placed in foster care. That's the front end. Now, the vast majority of children who come in contact with Child Protective Services never see foster care. I mean, in Kansas alone, I think there are over 60,000 hotline calls a year. 60,000. That's a lot. And there are less than 3,000 children. There are less than 3,000 or 4,000 children who are coming into foster care a year. And about the same number has been exiting. So when you think about 60,000 child welfare calls, and then you think that less than 3,000 kids, about 3,000 kids are coming in and out of foster care a year, that's a very small amount of compared to the hotline calls that are coming.
Yeah.
So the vast majority of children are just getting contact through social workers on that front end. And then if a child needs to be protected and they're placed in foster care, the child protective case is closed and the case transfers to another department, which is foster care. And with a whole new set of workers, usually in most states, that's a whole new set of workers, mostly because the parents are angry at the worker who took the children or recommended foster care, right? So now you need a new worker to engage with that parent. And so in most states, that's a separate department, separate workers, and often a separate agency, because many of these are contracted out to private contractors. So when you think of child welfare, try not to bunch that all together, but think of it as two separate, completely separate systems. The one thing that connects both of them is what's called services. So if a parent is using substances, if there's domestic violence, if there's mental health issues, if the children need therapy, those are services that serve both systems. And there are problems in all three of those arenas. Yes. So the root problem in all three of them, actually, this might surprise you, is related to one issue. And that is they all draw federal funds.
Oh, you mean the federal government is the problem?
Yes.
That's fine.
Yes.
Doesn't surprise me. Sorry.
All three of these arenas draw funds from the federal government. So child protection, even though those are state run, and the funds are state, what happens is in order to keep foster care monies flowing, the front end has to comply with quotas that's, well, outcomes and measures that says children will remain in their homes. So
Right.
90, the national standard is that 90% of those kids who are involved with services on the front end, 90% of them have to stay in their home in order to draw money for the foster care program. Does that make sense?
It does.
So,
It does.
so both are tied, and foster care in Kansas at least is 50%. 50% of that funding is from federal government. So if we lost federal government, we would lose 50% of our foster care funds. So, but they're tied to both systems. And then services are usually through federal grants. So substance abuse services, domestic violence, mental health, they all have ties into federal funds. And in every time there's a federal funding involvement, there is the requirement that children remain in their homes. So if you're a substance abuse provider and you're drawing down federal funds, one of the outcomes and measures is, are you maintaining children in their homes? So now I've seen this personally. So I had a family, the mother was testing positive for PCP every single Monday. But the substance abuse provider believed she was not using. Because mom denied it, right? And the substance abuse provider is like, she denies using, she's not using. Why? Because if they admitted she was using, those kids had to be removed from the home, see? And so federal dollars that have kind of infiltrated all of these services, including foster care and adoption in the front line, requires that children remain in their homes in order to determine success of the program. So if you're a successful worker, can you imagine as a fireman, if you were paid by federal dollars and you had some kind of outcome that said 90% of all the children in those homes have to remain in their homes?
Well,
Right? You have to put the fire out, around the family, but keep the home intact. That's an
yeah,
impossibility, right? But if
yeah.
that's your standard of measure, that changes how you practice.
Well, and
It's
you might be surprised, but and it's all about the money too. But in the fire service, I mean, I went to the National Fire Academy, and we were all about doing safety and as much as we could possibly do. But guess what? The funding elements of that still have and still are making it unsafe, not only for the firefighters, but for the people that we serve. So I get that
so
totally.
you get that. So the funding determines how you work, right? It's all about money.
Yeah.
And the feds require 90% of all children to remain in their homes in order to be considered a successful program.
Hmm.
That is the root problem of all three of these. So the answer is to lessen your dependence on federal funds. And
Right.
the problem is it's very hard for politicians and states to be willing to wrap their brains around less federal funds, because the moment you do that, you're considered to be someone who is against children, right? If you're not accepting federal funds for kids, then you're against kids. So we have to do this in a way that actually increases services, increases effectiveness before you say no to the federal funds. Does that make sense? You have to make the federal funds like, we don't need it because we're doing so great, not we're going to
Yeah.
reject those funds and then struggle, right? So here are some of my solutions. On the front end of child abuse investigation assessment. Oh, and by the way, I wanted to say one thing about foster care and the front end and the foster care system. Everyone pretty much knows that there are issues in foster care, right?
Yes.
How do we know that information? How do we know that there are some issues with foster care?
Well, the most egregious, I mean, I just got hit in the face with that fraudulent case in Arizona.
The
And
sex trafficking case?
yes,
Yeah.
yeah. And so obviously,
And
and not to mention all the individuals. I mean, because with the show and everything,
yeah.
you know,
So on foster care, apart from the departments, you have a lot of people having contact with those kids, right? And their cases and reading their cases and following the events of their cases. So you have a judge, a prosecutor, you have a guardian ad litem for the children, you have parents and parents' attorneys, you have grandparents and sometimes grandparents' attorneys, you have CASA, you have court staff, you have foster parents, and you have therapists. All of those people are watching and having some kind of contact with this child. So, whatever's going on in foster care, there's transparency because if something's going wrong, you're going to have foster parents, you're going to have CASA, you're going to have people saying something, right?
um,
Aside from the department, who has contact with children on the front end, on the front line?
one caseworker.
One caseworker and sometimes police. In Kansas, when I started in 1997, 90% of my caseload came from social workers who requested custody of children. When I left there in 2013, 90% of my cases were coming from police officers. 90% of my kids coming into custody were because police went out and picked up those kids because they found them in dangerous situations. So the only other entity that's really in contact with these kids for the most part are police officers. So also education. But under 7, it's just if law enforcement gets involved in a doing something with a family using drugs or domestic violence or something like that, then when police get involved, then kids are getting
Oh,
protected.
and in my experience with the fire department, I mean, we were, you know, we were involved in those types of cases, and
Sure.
we were, and it worked in Florida at that time. It worked pretty well because the police would be there always.
Mm-hmm.
It would be handled
By them.
that time,
Uh,
right then and there, and then we still reported it as caregivers. The hospital still reported it. The
uh-huh.
police still
Uh-huh.
reported, so that was taking place at that time. It doesn't seem like that's happening now.
Yeah, I don't know much about Florida. I mean, I've studied some about Florida, and I know actually that sheriff's departments are involved in some investigations in Florida as far as the primary entity. I do know that they have a lot of child deaths in Florida, and they
Yeah,
continue to
yeah.
see child abuse, neglect deaths there. Actually, one of the best solutions I've heard has come out of Florida, which we can talk about later.
Mhm.
Um, so one of the things I also want your people to know, and this is if you remember anything about this program, hopefully this piece will really stick with you, is child welfare workers cannot snatch children, kidnap them, or place them in custody. They don't have
Right.
that power. The only entity that has the power to put children in foster care is a judge. That's it. Now social workers go out, they're supposed to gather information. They're investigators, so they're supposed to gather facts and investigations and evidence to determine what should happen with children, but then they turn that over to a prosecutor. And if the prosecutor believes that evidence will win in court, that there's enough evidence to go to trial to protect those children, then the prosecutor files an action to protect those children. The social workers don't have the power to do that. So there is no place in America where social workers are just snatching up kids, kidnapping kids, placing them in foster care. In order for a child to actually get in foster care, the process is this: social workers or police officers go to the home, find something concerning regarding the safety of children. They send that information to a prosecutor who reviews that information, who asks the judge for an action. Once that action has come to court, within 24, 48 hours, 72, with somewhere in there, they have to have an emergency hearing. And that's when there's a child's attorney, parents' attorney, grandparents are there, and everybody gets to be heard on an emergency hearing. There has to be enough evidence to show a child is in danger to put that kid in foster care that the guardian ad litem is in agreement with, the prosecutor is in agreement with, the judge is in agreement with, and the parents' attorneys cannot overcome it. And, you know, parents' attorneys, to be honest with you, are some of the most aggressive, hard hitting attorneys there are out there. I've seen them really radically defend their parents. So this is not a system where social workers are running out and snatching kids.
Right.
You need to know that. That's just not happening.
And you know, and that point being made, I know there's also in one case, you know, this is stuck in my mind because I've been talking to Neely this whole time, but I guess there are times where that whole process fails, and the one I can think of is Neely Blanchard's case in Florida, where DCF is telling her, "Don't take your kid back. You know, she's being abused." Emergency hearing. You know, she shows up at the emergency hearing, and the offender is well represented with an attorney. Neely isn't, because she didn't think she had to be, and DCF never even showed for that hearing, and that the child went straight back to South Carolina. Neely went back to South Carolina and was arrested for violating her custody agreement and kidnapping the kid, basically. At the
That is,
there's problem,
there's a whole other set, and that's a really good thing to say. I'm glad you brought that up, because that is a domestic custody dispute case where child welfare may have been involved. And both Adrian Jones' case and Evan's case, there was some domestic court involvement. And right now in Minnesota, in the Justice case, there was some domestic court involvement in there as well, custody disputes. And I think we really need to look at that and find some solutions. There's a problem in custody disputes where the information from child welfare is not getting to those judges, and that information is not being reviewed accurately. And so, yes, I think there's a problem in domestic court. The process I'm talking about is what would be called juvenile court, dependency court, child welfare court. It is separate. Sometimes these courts are all have the same judge because of how different different court systems run across America, but they're two different processes.
Right.
So like in Kansas, you're going to see a different judge. In the metro areas, you're going to see a different judge for domestic than you are for the dependency, child in need of care, juvenile court. And sometimes those judges don't talk to each other. Sometimes they don't even know that those other cases exist, right? And so what I am talking about as far as placing in custody and the process for getting a child in foster care, that is a dependency court, a juvenile court. Yeah. What you're talking about is a domestic court, which has more to do with custody disputes between parents and those divorce situations. So that's a completely different animal. And I agree with you. There's problems there. And I've seen children not be protected in those courts. Those are very difficult because you have a lot of he said, she said.
Yeah.
Right. I don't like working on domestic cases because there's a lot of he said, she said, and how do you have the evidence? But when you have child protective workers involved who have hard evidence, that needs to get to domestic court, and those judges need to be educated on child abuse and neglect. So I agree with you. That really broke down. That process breaks down in that setting sometimes. Yeah. But in the juvenile court piece of foster care, the process I explained just now is in every case. So judges have to believe, and also in order to put a kid in foster care, you have to follow the Adoption Families Safe Act, which says that children have to be in an emergency, or you have to make reasonable efforts to keep those kids in their homes.
Right.
The judge has to, in order to keep federal dollars, Title IV-E dollars coming down from the federal government, you have to make those findings. And every couple of years, the feds come in and audit judges to see if those findings were made. There has to be an emergency, or there has to be reasonable efforts to keep those children in their homes. So there is no way that kids are just getting snatched out, right, of their homes and placed in foster care without due process and a lot of work going into it that indicate children are not safe. The real problem is that children are being left in their homes to be abused over and over and over again and dying because social workers are no longer asking to put them in foster care in order to keep foster care numbers down.
Yeah, and let me just
That's
crystallize
the problem.
that, because that was such an important point that you made yesterday, and that people need to realize is that when we talk about sex trafficking, you think, well, it's a network or it's this or which does
It
happen,
is.
but
Yeah.
but the majority of
Mm-hmm.
these are those children, just like Evan and Adrian, and probably thousands like them, that the system, because they're dependent on federal dollars, is saying, keep them there. That's what we have to do. We have to keep them there, keep them there. And the mother of that child, there's a good chance she was trafficked before she ever had that child, that with the substance abuse issues a lot of the
Right.
time. And
Right.
then after they keep that drug addicted baby with that mother, her
Yes.
partner, it's not the father, it's not the father of the baby, and it's generally a trafficker.
Right.
So I hope people can see that and
So if you
the
want to turn
size
this
of that.
off for sex trafficking in America, once a teenager who's in foster care or on the streets or whatever, 80% of those kids, in my opinion, we could have done early prevention sometimes at their birth, but before they're 7 years old. um, like I said yesterday, I had the privilege of overseeing the first rapid response team for the state of Kansas, and when I looked at the data and reviewed all the cases, I discovered that 80% of those kids had previous contact with DCF, where DCF could have prevented abuse and neglect, but we left them in their homes. And
Yeah.
so by failing to protect kids, we're leaving them in situations where they end up being trafficked. So once they're teenagers, it says that the median age of a trafficked child is 12. I disagree with that. Probably the median age is around 6, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean,
Absolutely.
what's half of 18? 8, 9. It's probably 9, because
Yeah.
I believe they're being trafficked from birth if they're born into a home where there's substance abuse and domestic violence, where a mom is using drugs, there's no man on the birth certificate, or the traffickers on the birth certificate. These children are born into these sex trafficking situations, and agencies are turning their backs and leaving those kids in those homes in order to reduce foster care. Adrian Jones and Evan Brewer, I have concerns that there was sex trafficking going on in both of those cases. In fact, if you read the Wichita Eagle, the perpetrator in that case, Mr. Bohine, I can't remember his name at the moment, he actually trafficked his own daughters.
Yes. Yes.
So he was a known sex trafficker.
Yeah. And
And
we will
so,
have the articles that Diane's talking about will appear in the show notes of this show.
so he was a known sex trafficker. And so here you have, if Evan had survived and lived, he probably would have been trafficked, right? Because mom's addicted to all sorts of drugs and she's living with a trafficker.
Yeah.
And so that puts that
Yeah.
child at risk for being trafficked. And so, okay, so now we've talked about 25 minutes about the problem again. So
We're
let's
gonna
talk
we're gonna have to do this again, Diane. That's all there is to it. but
uh, okay, so let's talk about some solutions. Let's talk about the solution on the front end. So if the root problem is one of the root problems is that there's no transparency, right? No one's looking in on these cases. Nobody knows how they're run. We don't know if these workers are even complying with the law, right? So
right.
you have to have some transparency. I believe the number one way to get transparency for these cases is to share information with law enforcement. So if
Did
law
everybody hear that? Did everybody hear that?
and if you read the Commission to Eliminate Child Abuse and Neglect Fatalities, if you read every state's child fatality review reports regarding abuse and neglect, children who die from abuse and neglect, the overwhelming consensus is we need more law enforcement involvement. So this actually fixes two root problems. So what I propose is that police officers going into a home where there's domestic violence, if they had access, real-time personal access to electronic records at DCF, they can get right in there, just like a DCF worker could get in there. They would know the history of this child. They would see that there were 10 reports on this child. they would see that this child was born positive for drugs. They would see that this child had services and was left in the home, right? And then had multiple other reports. They would be able to have that, and they would need that would inform their level of intervention at that time, right?
Right.
And also, I think it works the other way. When you have social workers about to go into a home, I don't know if you have kids, but I don't want my Susie, 22-year-old, brand new social worker just graduating from KU, going into these homes when there's criminal activity, drug abuse, domestic violence, and there's bench warrants out for their arrests. I mean, I think workers need to have access to law enforcement records, real-time access. Um, Maybe not every worker, but at least somebody in the office says, hey, I even think they need to run NCICs because these guys, these criminals, they jump
Yeah.
jurisdictions, right?
Yeah.
So I always got NCICs on my cases. I
Mhm.
didn't have access to the alert system, but I had access to request it. And that way I knew, am I dealing with someone who murdered a child in another state? Am I dealing with someone who, is wanted in another state? So if social workers could have access to that before they go into a dangerous situation, that would really inform their safety and the safety of those children, right?
And I can't, other than a few crazy civil liberties groups, I can't think of anybody that would be against that. And in my mind, it's not an infringement.
Will,
Every, every,
the
everything,
departments will be against it.
but our privacy is gone, whether people want to admit it or not, in everything that you do. And to make that kind of argument at this point, and so you can't
So
make
here,
your
so John,
DCF workers.
here's the facts of this situation. In Kansas, and I've reviewed the laws in several other states. So Missouri is similar, Minnesota is similar, and that is that there is actually a team of people who investigate, right? So the law actually says in Kansas, the secretary and law enforcement shall have a dual responsibility to investigate child abuse and neglect. And when you read the confidentiality and the release of information laws, those people have all access to the same information.
Okay.
There
Now,
is
why
there
isn't that happening in Kansas then?
so so because everyone protects their own system.
Uh-huh.
It's self-protection. It's pure and simple self-protection.
So it's your opinion that it's in the law already,
It's on the law, right?
but you have an agency
Mm-hmm. We have two
that's
agencies that don't want to give access. Well, there is some. I'm sure they're thinking, police officers need to be professionals, right? They shouldn't be getting into the system and looking for their neighbors, right? I mean, that's the fear. Is if you give them access, what are they going to do with that information? Police officers could do that with NCICs. I'm sure they probably do.
well,
You could.
that, and I know that's
But
highly controlled now. I mean, you used to, if you
right.
had,
Yeah, it is highly controlled and it's actually monitored,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And
you
so
can't just pull
if
an
the
NCIC
police
on
officers
somebody.
are looking into a case and they have no business in that case, there should be some kind of reprimand and disciplinary action because in order to get this access, you have to have top secret clearance in Kansas. So only those officers probably who need that top secret clearance should be getting it. Maybe not every police officer on the street, but they should be able to call someone in the moment who does have access, who can report back to that officer on the street and say that we recommend you pick up that child. This child has had lots of contact with child welfare. Here are the concerns, or also they should be able to say, hey, there's a grandparent in this system. Here's that grandparent's phone number. Call the grandparent, right? Instead of putting the kid in foster care.
Right.
So,
So
and then
Dianne, in
child
Kansas right now, what needs to occur for that to start happening?
well, because I don't think the departments would agree to do that on their own. I think there has to be a law requiring them to do that.
Okay, so a bill.
A bill needs to be written and sponsored that says law enforcement shall have direct access to DCF electronic records. so that they can make those decisions. And the same thing, DCF shall have access, direct access to law enforcement records. And I think if we do that, there'll be huge transparency. Now, all of a sudden, law enforcement officers and their supervisors will be able to see, what's actually going on in child welfare and how better to protect a child. And the workers, social workers in the field, will be able to know if they're going into a home where there's bench warrants out for people's arrests and there's criminal activity and domestic violence, and they'll be able to gauge their own safety and the safety of other children. I believe that if you had access to those records, sometimes social workers don't even need to go to the home, right?
Right.
If you looked at a case and there's a child in that home, and there's two people in that home who have bench warrants out for their arrest, and those are the caretakers, right? You just send the police to go pick up those people and pick up that child, right? You don't even need, and then you do your investigation, but you don't have to put yourself at risk by going into a dangerous situation. The social work turnover in Kansas is about 30%, and that's pretty same across across the nation. And one of the reasons I believe that there's so much social work turnover on the front end. Right. Now, the back end, the foster care system is different. They have a different reason for their turnover. On the front end, the reason for turnover is safety and lack of support from social worker supervisors. Mm-hmm. So, if you're dad and you have a 25-year-old social worker in the field who's constantly going into criminal homes, you're probably going to tell her to get out of this job.
Yeah. Yeah.
So husbands, boyfriends, fathers are telling their social work girls get out. So by having access to law enforcement, that really helps you gauge safety. So that is I believe that's a low-hanging fruit, something we can do immediately that will enhance the safety of children and workers.
Well, I'm all about results. My profession: take axe, break door. So, and that's what I'm going to do myself, because I don't, give advice, and I know I can go talk to my local congressman who has contacts in the state. I'm less familiar with my state delegates, but that's another trip I have to make. And anybody that's listening to this is what has to be done. We can talk about this all day on social media. We can tweet about it, Facebook about it, blah, blah, but until you get out of your chair and walk down and be heard and seen, none of this is going to change. And what a great goal to have. And I have to thank you for that, Dianne, because who would be against this? I mean, I know law enforcement is going to be against it. And I know maybe the administration of DCF is not going to be crazy about it, but I'm pretty sure all their workers will be very happy with that, and the families of these children. Right. So the
families of the children may not be too crazy about it, because once you start, that will lessen their ability to manipulate workers, and so they probably aren't going to be that crazy about it. But it's for the safety of the children, right? And it's for the safety of the workers, and it should already be happening.
I'm betting there's a grandmother in Kansas named Judy Conway that.
Yes. If this kind of transparency had been involved in Adrian's case, I guarantee you there would have been a different outcome for Adrian.
Yeah.
No doubt in my mind.
And and we can't, this is a huge problem. It's the solutions for the bigger parts of this, but you can only, it's like it's what they say, how do you slay a dragon? You start hacking his toes off. And this is something that can be done, so.
And even in Evan's case, I believe one of the problems is that law enforcement really was going to the home, and DCF was going to the home, but they didn't really coordinate their efforts and put all that information together ahead of time, right? There's domestic violence in the home, and was there other police officers going to the home responding to that domestic violence? I don't know. So if all of that was coordinated better, they could have had a more coordinated response, right? For one thing, in the Evan Brewer case, that child had he had a near fatality. And
Mhm.
when that call came in, DCF sat on it for 6 days.
Yeah.
They put it in preliminary inquiry for 6 days on a near fatality.
Well, we're gonna be changing stuff like that, and I believe you're gonna be out there at the forefront, and just all these survivors. I mean, whether it's families that have been through this, whether it's trafficking survivors, or they're amazing people, and
Really, truly, they are.
they're doing
Yes.
amazing things.
And just briefly before we'll probably have to do this again because I talk too much. But the solution for services and the solution for foster care, I just want to throw it out there. Um, I believe that there are some organizations starting up and getting running in this vein because people are seeing the same thing I'm seeing. But the key to services is, I believe, faith-based services that are free to the people that can really help address these issues. You do not need to um, you don't need to be draw down federal funds in order to have an AA meeting or an NA meeting, right?
Right.
And just can run these, right? So I believe that if churches started getting involved and reaching out to their communities with the gospel, that's the only hope for people who are involved with drugs and domestic violence and mental health. There is no hope. I have watched people for over 20 years go to the state for help in domestic violence, substance abuse, and mental health and get really very little help. Little change happens. But once people start getting involved with the faith community, then I've seen change happen for people. So the real key is for the church to love the poor and the prisoner and the orphan and reach out and they're not going to come to you. You have to go to them and start providing services for the poor. And then on foster care, the solution is for churches to provide free volunteer homes for children, not get paid for foster care.
Yeah.
If there is a volunteer movement in foster care, if one family in every church in America had one foster home in their church and supported that foster person, that foster family, we would end the foster care crisis in America.
Well, that's talk about doable.
Yeah,
So
that's doable.
fantastic. Um, I wanted to talk about safe review a little bit, and try to get
Yes.
some of that information, and maybe even a dumb fireman can figure that out and put it to use. Maybe firemen.
It's common. You could have written this.
I don't think so. So tell us about that, and I want to get a hold of the information, and
So
have.
you can Safe Review is a tool I created that represents my years of child protective work in Kansas. I learned it from the department. I learned it from mental health centers. I learned it from judges, administrators. I learned this from the great state of Kansas. All it does is puts on paper the common sense process of how to protect a child that we all know. It's intuitive, but it puts it on paper to help us, to help guide us, because child welfare has absolutely departed from common sense child protection. So by just writing it down and having a process, I hope to help people stick to their guns, so to speak, on how to maintain just common sense child protection. So SAFE stands for, it's an acronym that stands for safety, analysis, follow-up, empowerment. You can get more information on that if you go to my website, which is www.safeconsulting.org. Feel free. This is a free resource for anybody. Please don't change it or alter it or sell it, because it is my product, and I want to protect the fidelity of the model. So, but you're free to use it. You print it out and remember it. It's actually good for anybody in any circumstance that wants to protect a child. So safety obviously stands for safety, right? But it defines safety according to Webster Dictionary definition. Safety is the absence of risk and threat of harm. That's what safety is. But if you look at the policy and procedure manual in Kansas, it actually says safety is imminent harm.
Wow.
They're very confused about what safety is. The real working definition that child welfare is using for safety right now is safety is parent-child bonding. If a parent and child is bonded, that child's safe.
Wrong.
Wrong, exactly. But that is the working definition that everyone is using in child welfare right now. And what I mean by working is in practice. That's how they practice. They go to the home. If parent and child are bonded, child is looks dressed and clean, that child is safe. And then risk is threats that can be exploited because of vulnerabilities. And those threats can be averted through preemptive action. That is what risk is. In child welfare, they separate risk from safety. And so risk is something that happens in the future that you cannot know, but determines services. Safety, they believe, is when there's an imminent risk or an imminent threat at this very moment. Like a child has to be being beaten in the moment for you to determine that they're not safe. They're not looking at threats to the child. They're looking at immediate current action against the child. And so they have redefined risk and safety to something that the common person would not even recognize. So that's why I've written those definitions. You read it and you're like, well, of course that's risk. Of course that's safety. That's all common sense. Yes, it is. But that's not what's happening in child welfare. But stick to your guns and don't let anyone talk you out of it. So if they say a child is safe, ask them to define safe, because they have a different definition of safe, right?
Yeah.
And so that's the first step, is to identify threats to children, their vulnerabilities, and what preemptive actions need to be happening to keep them protected. That's the first step. The second step, and actually the way you determine all of that, is by gathering information called analysis. It's investigating and assessing information, and that's also not happening in child welfare for various reasons. They are not doing true investigations anymore. The third step is a follow-up plan. So if you see that there's some safety concerns, you do your investigation and you see these threats, well, then you need to have a plan to preemptively act to prevent that child from being hurt by those threats, right? That's called follow-up. So you need a plan. It's very simple, isn't it?
Yeah, but I could just see you talking to some of these administrators in here. It's like, and they know this, but they just don't want to hear it right now. But
well,
they're going to hear it.
They would disagree with my definitions for sure. I mean, then the last four is empower. The last of the four steps in the process is called empowerment. And this is where you actually monitor parents to ensure they're following with the plan. You're holding them accountable. And this absolutely is not happening in child welfare anywhere. No one is holding parents accountable. They want parents to be their buddies. They want parents to be their partners. They want parents to be their friends. They believe parents' word. They don't investigate them. And so they're not holding them accountable for the protection of kids. And that is really a very big missing piece in child welfare. We have to hold caregivers accountable. So that's safety in a nutshell.
All right, Dianne, you're amazing, and I'm sure we're gonna, if you'll agree, have you back on here, and I'm gonna get started with this, and I know quite a few people, and probably yourself included, that we can have that happen at the least, to try to get law enforcement and DCF sharing information, and I'm going to chronicle my little results there with my my smartphone and my local representatives, and I think other people should do that too. You know, that's what social media is for. You know, do we care? You know, who? I can't even think of a name, but who? Wait a minute. Oh God, what's her name? Okay, Lynn, or no, not or Britney Spears. There's one. Do we care? You know what Britney Spears is wearing this week? No,
Or
but
eating for breakfast.
yes, yeah.
Yeah,
So
but,
I,
but
I watched a little TV. I couldn't even come up with a
but
name.
I believe that your listeners, your watchers can save a life
Yeah,
by contacting the representatives and asking for them to make it a law that law enforcement and child protective services share information real time and have access to each other's information systems. That could save a child's life, and it could save a social worker's life too.
both. All right.
So,
Well, you've given us a great place to start and some great background, and I'm sure there's so much more that we can get out there and to educate people on this and to start to make some changes. So
great. Thank you for your time. You have a lovely Saturday.
I'm in your debt. Thank you. We'll talk soon.
All right. Bye bye.
Thanks, Dianne.